And then in our database, we should see a new card. And there it is. And now we have a cookie for this card ID instead. Now later I will also explain to you how you can delete cards automatically if they haven't been updated for a while, so that we don't accumulate a lot of abandoned cards in our database, right? But for now, let's ignore this. Now, of course, we could also get rid of this loading state here and let the database operation run in the background. But for something like a shopping cart, it's actually better to have a loading spinner and then a success message, so that the user has a confirmation that the item was successfully added to the cart. Because if they click add to cart and then navigate away and then the item wasn't actually added to the cart for some reason, maybe it threw an error, maybe there was some other problem, then it's a bad user experience if they don't actually see the item in the cart. This is why for an e-commerce app, it's actually better if there's a loading spinner and a success message after the operation has finished. And this is also how Amazon does it, by the way. Let's also add another item, just to see that this works as well. A green bottle, for example. Again, add to cart, add it. Let's check the cart items collection. And now we have one of these bottles in here, which should be this one. This has the product ID 588A, which should also be the ID of the bottle here, yeah. B88A. Now at first I was worried about race conditions when we click this button multiple times in a row, because this also creates a new cart when we don't have one yet, right? And we want to avoid accidentally creating multiple cards because we hammer this button multiple times in a row. But when you try this out, you will actually notice that these server actions are executed in succession. So even if we click the add to cart button multiple times, it will first execute the first server action, and after this has finished, it will execute the second one, which then increments the quantity. So there is no race condition. At least this is how it works in the moment. Again, server actions are in alpha. Maybe they are changing this behavior in the future, but at least for now, this works exactly like it should work. Let's actually try this out as well. Let's delete our cards for a moment. We can just delete the whole collection. It will be recreated when we create a new card. And let's do the same for the card items. I'm gonna refresh the page. And then I click add to cart fast 2 times in a row, and it should create only one card and then increment the quantity of the existing item to 2. So click 2 times. Let's check our database. Let's refresh this. So there should be one card and one card item with a quantity of 2. So this worked. There is no race condition and our app works fine. Okay, cool. Later we will add our cart page where we can change the quantity of the existing items. So then we will use another server action. But for now, let's add the navbar and the footer to our page so that we can navigate between our different pages and also show our cart and navigate to our cart later. Okay, before we set up our navbar, I want to make one more little change to our schema file. I want to add onDelete cascade not only to the product, but also to the cart. Here in the cart item model. So again, comma, onDelete cascade with this spelling, because now when we delete a cart, all the corresponding cart items will be deleted as well, which I think makes sense. Alright, and then we want to set up the navbar that we put at the top of our page so that we can navigate between different pages and we don't have to type in the URL all the time. We could put the navbar into the components folder, but since we use it throughout our whole app, I like to put it directly into the app folder here. In here we create a new folder called navbar because we need multiple files in there. And the first file we put in there is navbar.tsx. Of course we use the navbar provided by Tailwind UI. You can find it in the documentation. There are different variations. You can find the code of it. But the one we are building here combines different elements of this page into one. We use the shopping cart item, we use the search box. So let's go back into our project and export a default function called navbar. Okay, and in the return statement, let's start building the UI of this navbar. We start with a div, which we give a background color with the class bg-base -100. Before we continue, let's save this and then put it in the UI. And we want this navbar to be visible on all pages throughout our website, so we put this in the root layout. It's part of the HTML body, but not part of the main tag. So above the main tag, we just render our navbar and save it. Let's see if we can already see something in the UI. Not yet, but we will see something when we put content in here. Into this outer div we put another div, to which again we add some class names. So the first one is navbar, which is coming from this UI, and this adds some CSS attributes to style this like a navbar. Then I want to give this navbar the same max width as the content of our pages, so that the elements of the navbar don't stretch out throughout the whole screen. So again we use max W7XL. That's also the value that we used here in our layout for the main container. We use the same one here. And this is why I wrapped this into this outer div, which applies the background color of the navbar, because I want the background color to take up the full width, but the contents of the navbar be constrained within this max width here. And to render this on the screen, we add a margin auto. Then we make this navbar a flex column. The flex class is not necessary because that's already included in the navbar here. Flex column means the elements will be aligned below each other, but we only want this to be the case on small screens. So we add a breakpoint here, SM, so on small screens and higher, the only value below SM is XS. So flex col will be applied on XS screens, so on very small screens, and on slightly larger screens, SM, and larger, we want to set this to a flex row, so the elements are aligned horizontally. And then we also add a gap of 2 to get some space between the items. You will see how this looks in a moment after we added items to our navbar. So the first item I want to put in the navbar is the logo and the name of the website, which we wrap into another div, which we give the class name flex1. This adds this flex110% attribute, which defines how these items stretch over the available space of the navbar. Then in here we put a next link so that we can click this item and navigate to the front page. So we set the href to just slash as a string to get to the home page. And inside this link we put a next image that will contain the logo of the website. Again, make sure the import is correct. We set the src to the logo, which I already included in the starting project. If you are not using the starting project, then you can get the logo out of the project on GitHub. So in src should be an assets folder, and in here is the logo, which I prepared. We have to import this here. So import logo from add, which is the root folder. In here is the assets folder. And in there is logo.png. That's what we want to use for the image source. And then we want to resize this to 40 pixels times 40 pixels. And we set the alt text to Flowmason logo. And then we close this. Okay, let's save this and see how this looks. So now we see our navbar with this logo in there. And I also want to put some text next to this logo, so still inside the link, but below the image. We write Flowmason, but I want to style this properly, so we add some class names directly to the link. We make this a button, or rather we style this as a button, it's still a link. Button Ghost gives this a certain styling that looks like this. Looks pretty cool. We make all the text in here larger with text XL. But the button automatically makes this all uppercase. We can revert this with normal minus case. And those are all Tailwind and Daisy UI classes. So now we have this link here with the logo and the name. And when we click this, we get to the front page. Really cool. Okay, below this div here, so the flex1 div, we put another div, which will contain the search field and the shopping cart button, but those will be aligned on the right side, whereas the logo is aligned on the left side. So flex 1 basically makes this part here grow to all the available space, and it pushes these elements that we put into this div to the right side. To this div below we add the class names flex none and gap2 as well to get some spacing in here. Then in here we want to put a search field for which we use a form. So we put a form in here and we will use a server action to execute the search again. Into this form we pass a div with the class name form control, and again I'm getting these class names from the Daisy UI documentation. We close this div and add an input field in here, which gets a self-closing tag as usual. We give this input the name search query. We set a placeholder to search, and we style this like we did earlier on the add product page. We make this an input with the input bordered styling. Then I want this input field to take up the full available width with W-full, but the width will still be constrained by the tags that wrap this input field. And then I also want to set a min width of 200 pixels so that we can't shrink the input field to a very tiny size where we can't use it anymore. And again, we can use an arbitrary pixel value like this. And when we save this, we see our input field. And this navbar should now also be responsive, right? So at a certain size, this should move below it, and it works. But the input field doesn't get too small. At a certain size, it will just say, no, I don't want to shrink any further. And this happens at 100 pixels. And to execute a search, we will use a server action again. And since this file is not a client component, we can just declare the server action directly in here. So we create an async function called search products. And the same as on the add product page, this takes form data. And at the top of this function, we add the use server directive. Then we want to get the search query out of the form data. So we create a const search query, and we have done this before. We call form data.get, pass the name of this input field, which is search query. And then we call to a string to turn this into a string. And then below we check if search query has a value, because we only want to execute a search if there's actually something typed into the input field. Then we call redirect, which we import from Next navigation. Make sure the import is correct. And we want to navigate to the search page, which we haven't set up yet, but we do this later. The URL will be /search, and we will pass the search query as a URL query param. So we add a question mark, query equals, without a space, and then we append the search query value. The cool thing is that redirect also works in server components and server actions. So we can execute this in here, and it doesn't require any JavaScript. So our search will work even if JavaScript is disabled, which is always nice to have. And to execute this when we submit our form, we do the same as we did earlier. We set the action to the name of our server action, search products. Now, if you are experienced with HTML, then you might think we could also just pass the URL that we want to navigate to the form action, instead of doing this detour through the server action. So we could just put this part here, directly down here, and remove the whole server action altogether. However, this would reload the page, which is a very jarring user experience. With our approach here, we are not reloading the page. We have this very soft navigation where the navbar and everything stays in place. And this just looks and feels better than using the normal URL action. Okay, but the button that shows the shopping cart will have to be a client component, because it shows a pop-up menu, and in order to show and close this pop-up menu, we need JavaScript. We don't get around this. So to not make this whole navbar a client component, we put this into a separate file, and we put this into the same navbar folder here. Let's call it shopping cart button and export a component with the same name as usual. Now to this shopping cart button we will pass the cart itself, so the shopping cart that contains the data of the cart. But we will fetch the cart in our navbar because this way we can fetch it server side and we don't have to use state or anything like that. We just pass it to our client component here. So at the top we create an interface, shopping cart button props, which will contain the cart, which is of type shopping cart. That's the type we created earlier with all the cart item and product information inside the cart. So we import this from the lib folder, but this can also be null because we might not have created a cart yet. Okay, and then we pass this cart to the component. So here shopping cart button props, and we destructure the cart out of there. And then we return some UI here. The outer element is a div, which we give the class names drop down and drop down end, which again are Daisy UI classes. For now, let's save this and let's put this shopping cart button into our navbar. So first we have to fetch the shopping cart, right? We can do this right here because this is a server component, but we have to make this an async function. Then we can create a const cart and call await get cart from our lib folder. And now we have the cart data and we can pass it to our shopping cart button. We put the shopping cart button here right below the form, opening angle bracket shopping cart button, and it expects the cart, which we already fetched. Then let's finish the shopping cart button. So back into this component, and most of the markup here is coming from the Daisy UI documentation. I just copied this for the most part. In here we put a label, which we give the tab index 0. The tab index is necessary so that we can use tab to navigate between items, which is necessary for accessibility. We style this with btn ghost and btn circle, which makes this round, and the normal btn class, which is the base button styling. We close this label tag, and then we wrap this into another div, to which we add the class name indicator, because this way we can have a little badge on our cart button that shows the current number of items in the cart. Then in here we copy paste the same cart icon that we also use on the add to cart button here. So you can either copy paste it from there or copy paste it from the GitHub repository. When we save this, we already see this cart icon here. And to add some number to this indicator here, we go below the SVG, but still inside this div, and add another span, which contains the number that we want to put in there. So we add an expression with curly braces. What do we want to put in here? We want to put the cart size in there, which is part of the shopping cart type, right? So when we fetch a cart, we return the size that we calculated earlier. And we want to display the size here. If this value is undefined because a cart doesn't exist yet, then we want to fall back to 0. And when we save this, it's not styled properly yet. We have to add the class name to the span as well. The first one is badge, then badge sm for the size, and indicator minus item. Now when we save this, this is styled properly and looks really cool, doesn't it? And this always reflects the actual number of items in our cart. So when we add another item, This will switch to a 3 after this has finished loading. And number 3. But we also want to show a drop-down menu when we click this item. So we go below this label here and add another div. Again, this div gets this tab index 0 value and some class names to style this. The drop-down will be styled like a card. Then we have drop-down content, and again you can find instructions on how to style these elements properly in the Daisy UI documentation. Then we add card compact, which adds some size styling. We need a margin top. We need a width, which we set to W-52. This is just the width of this drop-down menu. We need a background color with BG base 100, and we can add a drop shadow with the shadow class. And one more class, Z-30. This sets the Z index. This takes care that this drop-down menu is not hidden behind other elements, so it's on the foreground. Okay, then we go inside this div and put the contents of this drop-down menu in here. Again, we need another div. This is just unfortunately how HTML works. It's div within divs within divs. We style this with the card body class. And in here again I want to show the size of the card and also the subtotal. So the total dollar amount of our items combined right now. So inside this div we put a span with the class names TextLG for the text size and font bold, and this will say number of items. So we add an expression and then items behind. An index expression, we want to show the card size again or fall back to 0 if we don't have a card yet. And when we click our button here, we already see our drop-down menu. Now let's add a subtotal below as another span, which we give the class name textinfo. This changes the text color. And in here we write subtotal colon. And then we want to show the price, which we want to format. Remember, for this we have this format price function that we created earlier. To this we want to pass card.subtotal, which again we calculate when we return the card. Again, this might be undefined. In this case, we want to fall back to 0 again. Okay, save this. Now we have this value in here as well, and it's actually the correct value, so this is correctly calculated. One more thing, I also want to have a button in here that brings us to the card page where we can then modify our card, right? So below the subtotal span, we put another div with the class name card actions. This is for buttons that we put into this menu, but we don't use a button, we use a next link again because we are linking to another URL. But this import here is wrong. We don't want to import it from this dist folder. We want to import it from next/link. Sometimes auto import doesn't work for whatever reason, but the curly braces are wrong. We have to remove them because this is the default export. Okay, so this link will lead us to /card. Again, we haven't set up this page yet, but we will do so later. We style this link like a button with btn, a primary button with btn primary, and to take up the full width, we add btn block. And this button will say view card. So now we have this button here that brings us to the card page, which doesn't exist yet. Now, since this page doesn't exist, this drop-down menu closes when this page is loaded for some reason. But if we just for a moment change this to a page that does exist and click this button again, then you can see that the drop-down does not close automatically. We actually have to handle this ourselves. This is why we need JavaScript. Unfortunately, we can't close this drop-down menu without JavaScript. So make sure you set the href back to /cart. And then we add another prop to the link. We want to set the onClick handler here. And we want to call close dropdown. And we put this function here above the return statement. So we create a function that we give the same name. And what we want to do is we want to remove the focus from this button here, because this is what opens this drop-down menu. The way we do this is we get the currently focused element like this, document.activeElement, and you have to do this with these Daisy UI elements. You have to handle closing these drop-down menus yourself. Then we have to cast this to an HTML element. Then we have to check if we found an element. We want to remove the focus, which we do with lm.blur. Now when we save this, we will get an error, because onClick requires this to be a client component, because onClick needs JavaScript. So at the top, we make this whole shopping cart button a client component, save this, and then it should work. Again, just for testing purposes, I let this link us to the home page, but I set this back to the cart page in a moment. And now when we click this button, we get to the home page and the drop-down menu closes. Okay, revert this back. Okay, our navbar is finished. This is really cool because now we see the actual shopping cart data in here. Next, we want to set up the cart page where this links us to. But before we do this, I also want to add a simple footer to our website, just so that it looks more complete. So let's put the footer into the app folder as well, because it wraps the whole website. Footer.tsx, and this time I'm just gonna copy paste this whole thing because this is just some dummy markup. I actually copied this right from the Daisy UI documentation, and I will put a link to this file in the description below as well, so you can copy paste it from there. But again, this is just some placeholder. And then we put this into our root layout. Below the main content, we render the footer here, save this, and there's our beautiful professional footer that's also responsive, by the way. This looks really like right out of Amazon.com. Okay. There's one more bug I want to mention right now. Again, these server actions are still in alpha, so they have some bugs. We have to wait until they are fixed. Right now, while a server action is running, we can actually not navigate to another page over a link. To try this out for a moment, I want to add a delay to our increment quantity action. Again, I will remove this in a moment. So here I await a new promise. And I'm trying to remember the syntax of this. You don't have to write this. This is just to show you something. I just want to create an artificial delay, which we can do by awaiting a timeout. So let's say we delay this for 3 seconds, just for testing purposes. Now when I click this add to cart button, this will take over 3 seconds to finish, and while this is loading, we can actually not navigate to the front page over this link. So this is loading and I click this link and nothing happens. But this should work. We only navigate to the front page after this has finished, but this is a bug in server actions right now, so we just have to ignore this for the moment. There are discussions about this on GitHub, and I'm sure they will fix this eventually, but just that you know that this bug exists. So I want to remove this promise here again, and then we want to set up our cart page. Alright, let's set up our cart page. So we navigate to /cart when we click our view cart button here. This means we need a folder in our app folder with this name, cart, and in here we put a page.tsx. And then we export a default async function and we call it cart page. Then we return the UI. We wrap this whole page into a div. And in here we put a headline that says shopping cart or your cart or whatever you want to put in here. And we style this. We set the text to a 3XL. We make it bold and add some margin bottom. Let's see how this looks. View cart. and there's the title. We can also add some metadata to this page, as usual by exporting a const metadata. Static metadata here is enough, we don't need dynamic metadata. And we set the title to your cart dash Flowmason. And this changes the title here in the tab. Okay, so the cart is a server component, meaning that we can fetch data in here. We want to fetch the cart so that we can show it on the screen, right? Await get cart from our lib folder. And then I want to list all the cart items as a vertical list here on this page with the price and the subtotal and the image and everything. So here we put an expression. We take cart.items, which remember contains also the product information because we return our populated shopping cart. So all the data is contained in this items field. And then we want to map each cart item into a UI element. This UI element will also contain the server action, which allows us to change the quantity of an existing cart item. So for organization, let's put this into a separate file. And we can co-locate this with the cart page here. Let's call it cart entry.tsx. Again, this will be a client component because we need JavaScript in here. And then we export a default function with the same name. Now to this component, I want to pass a single cart item. So one of these cart item entries here, but I want the product information to be inside it, right? This is already taken care of by returning the shopping cart here from the getCart function, but we don't yet have a type that we can use for this argument. So let's go back into the cart file in our lib folder again, where we created this cart_with_products type. We also want the type only for this part here, for a single item that contains the product information. So let's add a second type below that we create in the same way. We export a type that we call cart item with product. Again, we create it with Prisma. This time cart item get payload, not cart get payload, but cart item. Then again angle brackets, curly braces. And in here we put the query that is required to populate a cart item, which is include : and we even get auto completion. Product : true. So we want one cart item with the product information inside it. Okay, we save this, we export this type, and then we can use it in our cart entry here. We create an interface for the props as usual. Cart entry props. We need one cart item, which is of type cart item with product that we just created. So this is one cart item with the quantity, but also the populated product. Then we add this prop down here, cart entry props, and we destructure the cart item out of it. And then we can show this cart item in the UI. So let's return a div in which we put another div, because below the cart entry we also want to put a divider, which is just a vertical line. So below this inner div we put another div with a self-closing tag that gets the class name divider, which again is coming from Daisy UI. And above in this div we put the actual product information. So this div here at the top needs some classes. Flex wrap, which is required for responsiveness. So if there's not enough room, then the elements will automatically move below each other. We want to center the items and give it a gap of 3. Then in here we put the product image as usual as the next image. We set the src to the image of the product, but we don't want to write cart item.product all the time. So we can destructure this cart item further with colon, curly braces, and we care about the product and the quantity. That's the data we need in here. And then down here in the image source, we can just write product.imageURL. For the alt text, we use the product name again. We set the width and the height to 200 pixels. And we make the corners of this image rounded with rounded LG. Then we close this. Before we continue, let's save this and add it to our map function here. So we map each cart item to one of these cart entries, to which we have to pass the cart item of this map function. And again, since this is a list, we also have to add a key with a unique identifier. For this we can use the ID or the product ID, shouldn't matter. And then we already see our product here. Really cool. Let's finish the cart entry layout and add the remaining information. So below the image we put another div. Then we add a link here, because the name of the product will also be a link to the product detail page. But auto import didn't work, so we have to import this manually. Import link from next/link. We set the href of this link to /products/ and the product ID, because this brings us to the detail page. And I want to set the class name to font bold. And then this link will just contain the product name. And there it is. Right below this link, I want to render the price of the product, of a single item. So in the div we write price colon. Again we use our format price function, to which we pass product.price. There it is. That's the price for a single green bottle. Then below this div I also want to show the total price. So the price of one item multiplied by the quantity. So we add another div here with the class names flex, item center and gap tour. And here we write total colon. And again we want to format the price, but this time it's product.price multiplied by the quantity. It's not product.quantity, it's just quantity, because that's part of the cart item. So the total price is $15.96, which is also shown in our cart dropdown. Okay, and I want to show the current quantity between these two divs here, but I also want to add a drop-down menu with which we can change the quantity. So we go below the price, but above the total. And here we add another div, but we are almost done. Again, we need some class names. We need some vertical margin, my1. We make this a flex box with item center and a gap of 2. Okay, then this will say quantity colon, and in here we put a select, which creates a drop-down menu in HTML. Then we need options for this drop-down menu. I want to have the numbers 1 to 99 in there, so that we can change the quantity. For this we need an array that contains the numbers 1 to 99. We create this array above the return statement. We create a const quantity options. This will be of type JSX element, but an array of JSX elements. And we initialize this with an empty array. Why JSX element? Because we want to put these option tags in there, which are HTML elements, and we can put them into a JSX array. But we want to do so in a loop that goes from 1 to 99. So we write for and create a normal for loop. Let I equals 1, that's the number we start with. I less than or equal to 99, semicolon, I++. This is just a normal for loop in JavaScript. And for each iteration, we want to take our quantity options and push a new element in here. As I already said, we want to put such an option tag in there. This option tag contains a text with the number, so we just render I in here, so number 1 to 99. And then we also have to set the value of this option tag to the same number. And since this is an array, we also have to set a key, for which again we use I. So this loop here creates a list of these option tags from number 1 to 99. That's all this does. And now we can render these options in our select tag here. So between the opening and the closing tag, we put an expression and we want to render our quantity options here. And this is how it looks. It's not styled properly yet. So let's do that next. We add class names to the select tag. Select, which is a Daisy UI class. Select bordered, W full, and a max width of 80 pixels. This way this input field stays responsive and it can shrink, but it will not be bigger than 80 pixels because that's enough. And this is how it looks. We can also set the default value to the current quantity, because when we open the page, we don't want this to show 1 if we have 4 green bottles in our cart, right? So we can add the default value prop, and we simply set this to the quantity of this current cart item. So now when we save this and refresh the page, this shows 4. And now when we change the quantity by selecting a different one, we want to execute a server action that changes the quantity of this item in the database. So we add the onChange prop here, which will be called whenever we select something in this dropdown. And here we get past this E argument, which is the dropdown menu itself. So we add a function body here, then we can get this value out of the dropdown menu and call our server action. And JavaScript is required to execute onChange. This doesn't work in a server component, unfortunately. This is why we have to make this a client component. But as we already learned, we can still call server actions in client components. So let's set up this new server action next. Again, we put it into the same folder. Again, we call it actions.ts, just like we did for the increment product quantity action, just that this function here will allow us to set an arbitrary quantity, and it will also revalidate a different path. It will revalidate this cart page to update it. But besides of that, we are not doing anything new in here. So we make this file a server action file. Then we export an async function that we call set product quantity, to which we pass the product ID, but also the quantity in form of a number. So this will look very similar to the other actions file we already have, just that here we only needed the product ID because we always increment it by 1, but we also need the cart in this other file and create one if it doesn't exist yet. So we copy this line here, paste it here. We have to import these functions from the lib folder. Again, we want to check if this article is already in the cart, so let's copy this line here as well. Put it here. And then we want to do one of 3 things. If we set the quantity to 0, we want to remove this item from the cart completely. If we set a positive value and the article is already in the cart, then we want to update this item with the new quantity. And if the item is not in the cart, then we want to create a new one. Now with our current UI, this third case is not actually possible because we can't set the quantity if the item is not in the cart already, but maybe you want to change the UI later. So we will take care of this possibility as well. So we check if quantity that we pass to this function is equal to 0. Then we want to check if the article is in the cart. Only then we can delete it, right? Then we call prisma.cartItem dot delete. We want to delete the item where, just follow along. The idea is equal to the article and cart idea that we just found. We want to delete this cart item. Else, if the quantity is not 0 but a positive number, then again we want to check if the article is already in the cart. In this case we call await prisma.cartitem.update to change the quantity. We want to update the same item as we used up here with the article and cart ID, so we can reuse the same where clause. But this time we also want to set the data. We want to pass the new quantity. And again, since the field and the variable name are the same, we can use the short syntax here. Okay, and then we add an else block to this inner if here. So if article and cart is not defined, if we don't already have this item in the cart, then we want to await prisma.cartitem.create, and we set the data like this. This will look similar to how we created the cart item here. So we can actually copy paste this over. The data is the cart idea, the product idea, but we don't want to set the quantity to 1. We want to set it to the quantity value that we pass to this function. And at the end of our set product quantity function, out of this outer if block here, we wanna revalidate the page again, right? With revalidate path. This time we wanna revalidate /cart, which again refreshes the page and fetches the latest data. And now we wanna call this server action in our cart entry file. But remember, this is a client component, and because of this one bug, we can't import a server action directly in the client component, because this will not work with Next.js later. So again, we have to import the server action in the page, which is a server component, and then pass it to the cart entry. But we haven't added the arguments to the cart entry yet. So over into the cart entry again, into the cart entry props. Here we expect the set product quantity, that's a difficult word, function, which is the server action. And again, it gets the same signature as the server action we just set up. It takes the product ID in form of a string and the quantity in form of a number. And it returns a promise of type void. And then we add it down here as well. But again, we import the server action in our page and pass it to the component. So let's go into the cart entry tag here, pass set product quantity, for which we import our new server action. Okay, we save this, go back into the cart entry, down to our onChange function here. First of all, we want to get the selection out of this field here, which we can do the following way. We create a variable. I'm going to call it new quantity equals parse int, because this contains a string and we want to pass this into a number. And the value is contained in this value that we get here, dot current target dot value. And there is the selection of this drop-down field. And then we want to execute our server action and pass this quantity to it. Remember, we need a transition to execute a server action in a client component to get the appropriate loading and error handling. So we scroll to the top of the cart entry file again. Here inside the function at the top, again we create this const is pending, start transition. The same one we used in our add to cart button. And we assign this to a use transition. Back down into the onChange handler. We have this new quantity here. Now we start a transition, to which we pass this async error function again. And in here we can call and await set product quantity, which is the server action, to which we pass the ID of the product, and the new quantity that we just selected. And again, to have some feedback, I want to show a loading spinner while the server action is running. We put it here below the total price. We don't need a success text this time because we see the up-to-date value in the dropdown, so a loading state is enough. We add an expression here, check if isPending is true. And if this is true, we want to render a span again that contains the loading spinner. So span with the class names loading, loading spinner, and loading SM for the size. Okay, and when we save this, this should now work. Let me select a different quantity, 3, it loads, and it changed the quantity, also up here in the navbar, and also the total price. This all gets refreshed because we call revalidate path here, which revalidates this whole page and fetches the latest data. But I put this loading spinner in the wrong place. I actually want to have it inside this div here, so that it's shown right next to the total price. So now it looks like this. Just one more addition, I also want to have an option for 0, right? So that we can remove an item. We put this above the quantity options. I don't make it part of the loop because the text will be a bit different. So we add another option here. And the text will not only contain the number 0, but also remove in parentheses. This is also how Amazon does it. And the value will be 0. And remember, in our server action, 0 means that the item will be completely deleted from the cart. So let's try this out. Let's refresh this so we see the correct data again. Now we have 0 remove, which removes this item from the cart completely. But then it also makes sense to have some text here when our cart is empty, right? So it doesn't just look like this and the user might be confused. So let's go into the cart page once again and go below the map function here inside the div. We add another expression. We want to check if cart.items.length, which means that it's either undefined or 0. If this is the case, we want to render a text. So we can use a paragraph tag for this, or a div, doesn't really matter because it's unstyled in Tailwind anyway. Your cart is empty. There's the text. And then I also want to put the total price of all cart items at the bottom and a checkout button. So below this expression, we put another div. In here we put another paragraph tag, to which we add the class name MB3 for a margin and font bold. This will contain the total price, just like we show in the navbar. So this says total colon, curly braces, format price, and to this we pass cart.subtotal. And again, if this is undefined because we don't have a cart yet, we fall back to 0. There is the total value, it's 0 right now. And below we put a checkout button, which we style with btn and btn primary. And this will say checkout. Again, we don't add functionality to this checkout button here. If you want Stripe integration, then let me know in the comments below. Then I will make a separate tutorial about Stripe. I also want to center these items. So we add a class name to this div. We make this a flex box and a flex column. And what I want to do is on very small screens, I want the button and the total amount to be on the right side because that's usually easier to click when you are on your phone and you want to use your thumb. And on larger screens, I want to align this in the middle. Also, I just think it looks cool for responsiveness. So again, we can use breakpoints for this. We use items end to align the items on the right side. And then on small screens and larger, we use items center instead. One more thing, I also want to change the size of the checkout button, but only on this SM breakpoint. So here we add SM colon, and then I want to set the width of this button to a hard-coded 200 pixels, which makes it a bit wider. So now the button and the total amount are centered like this. but on very small screens, it moves to the right side and the button gets a bit smaller. I think this just looks better and it's great for usability, I think. Okay, let's format this and just try it out one more time with different cart items to make sure this works. So some headphones, add to cart. Again, this glitch where the font flashes for a moment will not be in production. This only happens in development. So maybe let's add 2 cameras and maybe 1 bar stool. Go to the cart, we see our subtotal here. We also see it here at the bottom and we see the correct quantities, right? Which we can also change. It updates all these values. And again, if we change the price, for example, of a product in the database and the user comes back to their cart, then these changes will be reflected in the UI. The way we fetch our data, they will always see the latest price and the latest product information. So this works really cool and professionally in my opinion. Okay, cool. Then the next step is to add user authentication into our website so that a user can log in and can also connect a shopping cart to their account. So very exciting stuff, you don't want to miss this. To handle authentication, we will use Next.js, which is an authentication library specifically for Next.js. It works with different authentication strategies, so we have a lot of different providers available. In our app here, we will only implement the Google provider to have Google login, but you can easily add additional login providers later if you want. And it also has different database adapters that we can use. There is an adapter for Prisma and MongoDB, which makes it very easy to store user information and also session data in our MongoDB database using Prisma. Here you can see that we have some stuff that we have to add to the Prisma schema, but I will show you exactly how this works in a moment. To implement Google authentication, we need a project in the Google Cloud Console. So you can either go to console.cloud.google.com or click on the link in the video description, and then we want to set up a project here. This is free to use. If you already have a Google account, then you should also be logged in automatically. And here we can create a new project. I'm gonna call it Next.js e-commerce. And then we click on create. This takes a moment to create this new project. And then when this is done, we click on select project, which selects this project up here on the drop-down. Okay, and then in the sidebar, we want to go to credentials, which is part of APIs and services. Here we have credentials, but we have to go to the OAuth consent screen first because we have to set this up first. Okay, let's go through these steps. User type external, because we want to make this website available to all kinds of users, at least in theory. Create, we have to give this app a name. Next.js e-commerce. User support email, for this we can select the email address of this Google account. We don't have to upload a logo. I think we can leave this stuff here empty for now as well. Developer contact information, again I'm gonna use the same address here, codingandflowrecording@gmail.com. And then we click on save and continue. Here we can select scopes. We only need the user profile info and the email address. This doesn't require access to any specific Google service, and we also don't need any special permissions to get these values. We click here on update. We don't need any sensitive or restricted scopes, so we click on save and continue. We can set up test users while this app is not in production that are allowed to log in. Again, I'm going to use the recording email address and maybe add a second one here, info@codingandflow.com. Add. Save and continue. Okay, now we can confirm this. External, we have a project name, email address, and so on. Scopes, test users. Yeah. Then we click back to dashboard. So this app is now in testing mode. If you ever want to publish your website, then you also have to publish this Google app to make it available in production. But for testing purposes, this is now working. And then we want to set up credentials. So we click on credentials here in the sidebar and then on create credentials. And we need an OAuth client ID. The application type is a web application. Name, maybe let's call this Next.js app or whatever. Then for authorized redirect URIs, we add the URI to localhost 3000 with HTTP colon in front of it. That's not HTTPS. On localhost, that's just HTTP. And then we need this exact path here, because this is what Next.auth expects. This is where Google will redirect us to after the login was successful, and this is where Next.auth reads the data out of the Google profile and gives it to us basically. So this has to point to /API/auth/callback/Google. We add this here, and of course later in production you have to add a second redirect URL with the actual deployment domain. Okay, we click on create, and then we get a client ID and a client secret. And we want to put both of them into our end file in our project, where we already have our database credentials. So here we add the Google client ID, and then we copy paste this value over here from your Google Cloud Console, and a Google client secret, which was the second string that we got. We paste it here as well. Then we can close the Google Cloud Console because we shouldn't need this anymore. Now our client is set up and we can use this to log in via Google. There are two more environment variables that we need for Next.auth. The first one is Next.auth_URL, which contains the base URL of our website. And you have to give this variable this exact name with the same spelling, because Next.auth expects a variable with this name. So we set this to the base URL again, http://localhost:3000. And then we also need a Next.auth_secret. This is just a random string, so you can type any letters in here that you want. That is used to encrypt the session cookie later. This is just needed for security, and this is basically a password. You can add any string you want here. This Next.auth secret is only required in production. Later we will deploy this website, and then we will get an error if we don't have this value set. Okay, let's save this. And then the way Next.auth works is that we have to set up a route handler, so an API endpoint in Next.js, under a very specific URL. And every authentication request will then go to this URL, and Next.auth will handle this. This is also where we pointed the redirect URL in the Google Cloud Console to earlier. So we go in the sidebar here. In the app folder, we create a new folder called API. And we have to put this folder in here with this exact name, because Next.auth expects a very specific route. In here we put another folder called auth. Then another folder called square brackets ... Next.auth as one word. And in here finally we put a route handler, which we call route.ts. Route handlers are how you set up API endpoints, so server endpoints in a Next.js 13 app when you use the app router. And this part here with the ... is a so-called catch-all segment. This allows Next.auth to handle different routes under this endpoint and not just a single one. Okay, and in this route.ts file, we export const auth options, and this time the name is arbitrary again, so this doesn't have to be called auth options. And this will be of type Next.auth options, which is an import from Next.auth, and this will just contain the Next.auth configuration. The reason I put this configuration into a separate variable and export it from this file is because we also need this object later in other places in our app. Okay, and we set the adapter to Prisma adapter. This is available in Next.auth by default, and this allows us to save user information and session data in our MongoDB database using Prisma. So this works together really well. And to the Prisma adapter we pass our Prisma client. Now this complains because there's a TypeScript problem that requires us to also cast this to an adapter, to a Next.auth adapter, so that this error message disappears. Sometimes there are some TypeScript shenanigans that you have to work around. Comma, and then we set providers to an array. Here you can add multiple providers, but again in this video we only add Google login. So here we pass a Google provider. Okay, autocomplete doesn't work. The import is import Google provider from next.ref/providers/Google. There it is. Now we can use the Google provider down here and configure it with curly braces. This expects the client ID and the client secret that we already have, right, in our environment variables. So we can get them with process.env. We need the same name, Google client ID, and client secret is process.env.Google client secret. Now this complains we will get rid of this error in a moment, but first let's finish this file here. So we have our auth options, and below we create a const handler. Again, this is explained in the next auth documentation. Here we call this next auth function, to which we pass the auth options. And this sets up next auth with this configuration here, with our Prisma adapter and the Google provider. And then we have to export it the following way. Export curly braces, handler as get, comma, handler as post. This weird syntax is necessary because right now Next.auth is still configured to work with the old pages directory in Next.js and not with the app directory that we are using. And this is why we have to write a special syntax to make this work with route handlers. But this is totally valid. This is also described in the documentation. Now this here complains because an environment variable can always be undefined because we might have forgot to set it. But the Google provider expects defined values for client ID and client secret. Now one simple way to get around this would be to just add the non-null assertion operator here with exclamation marks. But this is actually not great because if we actually forget to set these environment variables, then we will continue with undefined values and this will just misbehave. It's better to actually check if all our environment variables are set and throw an error if this is not the case. This is why we also installed the Zod library here. We can use this to validate values, for example our environment variables. This is a very useful thing to do in your Next.js projects so that you can always work with defined environment variables, and I will show you how you can set this up. We want to go into our lib folder again and put another file in here which we just call env.ts. Here we want to import Zod from Zod. Then we create a validation schema for our environment variables. Const, I'm going to call it env schema, and then we can create such a Zod object. In the Zod object we can pass validation rules. And in here we want to add the same variables that we also have in our normal.env file. So we want to copy all these 5 names and paste them in here. And now we can add validation rules to all of them. And they all have the same rules. They are all strings that are not empty. So behind each of them we write a colon. And by the way, you can duplicate the cursor by pressing somewhere. Then you hold Ctrl-Alt. I guess on Mac this is Command-Alt, I'm not sure. And then you press the down arrow. And then we press the end button on the keyboard to get to the end of the line. But you can also handle each line manually if you want. Okay, so each of them will be a Zod.string, which is a function. And then we also call non-empty to guarantee that this string contains something, and a comma at the end of each line. Now below, we export a const that we call env, and we assign this to env schema.parse. This way we can pass a value to the schema and validate it. And what do we want to pass? Well, we want to pass all our environment variables to it. Because we expect our environment variables to adhere to this exact schema. We should have these 5 keys that are all non-empty strings. And now if one of them is missing or empty, then Zod will throw an error with a readable error message instead of just giving us an undefined value. And now we go back into our route file. And instead of process.env, we just use env and we import this from our lib folder, the file we just set up. And now since we validated this with sort, this is guaranteed to be a string. If it's missing, we will get an error. Okay, next we go into our root layout and we have to wrap our whole layout into a session provider. What this does is it makes the session, so our logged in user, basically available to all components throughout our app. This is actually only necessary to get a session in client components, because in server components it works differently, and we would not need this in our app because we fetch all our session data server side, but it's still good to add this, because if you need a session client side, then you need this wrapper. Okay, autocomplete doesn't work, so we have to import this manually. Import destructure from Next.js/React, and in here we can find this session provider. And we want to wrap our navbar, our main tag and the footer into the session provider, again to make the session available to all our pages. But when we save and refresh this, I think we should get an error. Yeah, there it is, because this uses React context internally and this requires a client component, but the root layout is a server component. Now we could make the whole root layout a client component to fix this, but there's actually a better way to fix this. Basically what we want the session provider to have to use client directive at the top, just like our own client components. The problem is many of these libraries haven't added this yet because React server components are still newer and we can't go into the source code of the session provider and add use client there ourselves, right? But there is an easy workaround for this. We just have to export these third-party components that we want to turn into client components from our own client file. So we go into our app folder and put a new file here, which we give the same name, session provider.tsx. We make this file a client component, and then we simply re-export the session provider from Next.js. So we add the same package here, but this time we write export instead of import. So again, Next.js/React. And here we have the session provider, but we want to make this the default export, which we can do with this syntax. Then we go back into our root layout and we want to change the import statement here. We don't want to import this from Next.js anymore, but our own file. So dot to get into the parent folder /session provider. And since this is now the default export, we can delete these curly braces. And now this should work because we turned the session provider into a client component. We can still use all the features of it, no problem. But now we can also use it inside a server component. Next, we have to add some newer models to our Prisma schema. This is described in the Next.js documentation. They have instructions for the different adapters and we are using the Prisma adapter. We have to add these models here, the account and user, session and so on. And then we also have to make some modifications to make this work with MongoDB, but I already prepared all of this. Let's go back into our project and into the schema.prisma file. And at the bottom, below the card item model, we have to copy paste a bunch of new models. I will put a link to this schema file into the video description below, so you can copy paste this from there. So this includes the user account. This contains the username, email address and the image, which we get from Google when the user signs in. Then the Google account information is stored as well in a separate collection. There is some stuff in here that we don't actually need, but we might need this in the future if we change our authentication strategy, so it's good to add all of this. Then we also store a session in the database when the user is logged in. Sessions are alternative to JWT authentication. When you connect Next.js to a database using one of these adapters, the Prisma adapter in our case, then authentication will automatically be handled with sessions. Session means that when a user logs in, there is a session entry created in our database that contains the user ID and an expiration date. Sessions are easier to use correctly than JWTs because you can invalidate sessions simply by deleting them from the database. So if a user changes their password, for example, and you want to log them out everywhere else, then you can just delete their sessions. Whereas this is not possible with JWTs by default because they are self-contained. In order to implement JWTs properly, you have to implement a complex refresh token mechanism. This is also possible. It's also possible with Next.js, but sessions are much easier to use correctly. But again, Next.js handles these sessions automatically for us. We don't have to create them, Next.js does this. And then we also have this verification token model. As far as I know, these are only used if you implement login with an email link, which we are not using here. But again, it's still good to add all of these models at once in case you want to add additional authentication strategies. Okay, and then we also want to be able to connect a shopping cart to a user, right? So that we don't only have anonymous shopping carts where we store the cart ID in a cookie. Instead, we can also store a user ID on a cart and this way know which user this belongs to. So on the cart model, and I put this above the timestamps, we add a user ID, which will be of type string. This will contain an object ID, but we make this value optional with a question mark after string, because anonymous shopping carts don't have a user ID, right? And then we also need this object ID annotation, because this contains a MongoDB object ID. Then we also add the relation below, like we also did for the product and the cart on the cart item. We call this one just user. It will be of type user, which is our user model that we just copy pasted. It's optional again because it's connected to the user ID, which is also optional because a cart could not belong to a user account. Yeah, and then we add the same line as here basically. Just that we change this to user ID. We press the formatting shortcut to align this properly, and the counterpart to this user field here is on the user model, this cart array. I think if we delete this and press the formatting shortcut again, yeah, it gets added back automatically because this belongs to this user relation we set up here. This relation basically allows us to do two things. First of all, when we delete a user, we can automatically delete their cards. And for an existing user, we can fetch all their cards if we allow multiple cards per user. But again, this whole file is linked in the video description below, so you can copy paste it from there. It's still good to understand what is going on here. Okay, and then we want to push these changes to our database to create these new collections. So we open the terminal, stop the execution, and run npx prisma-db push again. As you can see, it created and configured a bunch of new collections, which we should now find in our Atlas backend. Sessions, verification tokens, users, and so on. They are all empty right now. And then we want to regenerate our Prisma client to have these new methods available. I think this actually happens automatically when you run db push, but just to be sure, we run npx prisma generate again, which generates this new updated Prisma client. And then we npm run dev again. Okay, and then I want to put a newer button into our navbar that shows the profile picture of the user when they are logged in and also contains a drop-down menu to log out. This button needs to be a client component because we need to handle button clicks there. And the same as we did for the shopping cart button, let's put it into its own file so that we can keep the navbar itself as a server component. So we have the shopping cart button, we create a new file, which we call user menu button. So then we export a default function, user menu button, and here we return a div. We also add props, interface, user menu button props. We want to show the currently logged in user in this user button. and we can get the user out of the session, and we get the session from next off. So we add session colon as a prop, and we set the type to session from next off, this one here. So this is the import statement. But the user might not be logged in, so we add a vertical bar and null, so that we can also pass null for the session. Now we could also fetch the session directly in here with this use session hook from next off. This fetches the session client side, but I want to fetch the session server side in our navbar, which is a server component, because this way the session data is available as soon as our page is opened. There is no short moment when the user is not authenticated, instead the user is logged in right away. And this is also how we set up our shopping cart, right? I want there to be no loading time. Instead, I want all the data to be there as soon as the page is opened. Again, because I think this feels more professional. And this is also how it works on websites like Amazon. This is why we don't get the session directly in here, because this has to be a client component. We also add the use client directive at the top, because we later need to handle on-click events here. And this is only possible in a client component. Then we destructure our props as usual here in the function. User menu props, and in here is our session. And then the first line of this function, we want to get the user object out of the session, which we can do with session.user. And it adds the save call operator because the session can be null. Okay, and then we finish the layout itself. We add some class names to the outer div. Again, we use dropdown and dropdown end, which we also used before for the shopping cart button. Again, we put a label with this tab index 0 in here. And we add some class names to the label as well. btn, btn ghost, and btn circle. Again, the same classes we used on the shopping cart button. Okay, and then in this button, I want to show something different depending if the user is logged in or not. So we add an expression that checks if the user is defined. We use the ternary operator with a question mark. If the user is defined, I want to render the user image in the next image. Before we set up this image, let's also add the second part of the ternary operator. Colon, if the user is not defined, I want to render 3 little dots here, which indicate that this is a drop-down menu. For this we use an SVG again, and again I will link this file in the video description so you can copy paste it from there. We can't get around this because we can't type this out by hand, we can only copy paste these SVGs. Let's press the formatting shortcut so this gets aligned properly, and again Prettier automatically adds these parentheses, which are very useful. For the source of the image, we want to pass user.image, and again we get this from Google when we log in. This will automatically be filled with the image of the Google account of the user, but user can be undefined, right? So we have to add a save call operator here, and we want to use something else as a fallback. For this I prepared this profile pic placeholder image, which is in the assets folder, this one here. I want to import this and use this as a fallback. So at the top, we import profile pic placeholder from /assets/profile pic placeholder png. And then we can use it as the fallback here. Profile pic placeholder in case the user or the image is undefined. We set the alt text to just profile picture. I think this is enough. We set the width and height both to 40 pixels. And then we also want to style this with W10, which sets the width of the image but in CSS to the same 40 pixels as we also loaded. Because again, the final dimensions are dictated by CSS, not by these values we are using here. At least when we use this component. And then we want to make this a circle, which we can do with rounded full. This sets the border radius to over 9000, and this creates a round image. Okay, so if the user is logged in, we see their profile picture. If they are not logged in, we see this SVG, which is 3 little dots basically. You will see this in a moment. And outside of this label, but still inside this div, inside the drop-down menu, we add the drop-down menu items. So in here we put a UL, an unordered list. This is just a normal HTML tag. And to the opening tag of UL, we add this tab index 0 again. Again, this is necessary for accessibility so that we can use tab to navigate between our menus. And again, this needs a class name, which are drop-down content, menu, rounded box, and again I got all of them from Daisy UI. Menu minus SM. Then we need this C index again to make sure that this menu is in the foreground. We add the margin top with MT3. We set the width to W52. Let me make this bigger. We set the background color with BG base 100. Then we need some padding. And lastly, we also want to give this a shadow. Not SM, but just normal shadow. And into the UL, we put list items for the single buttons in our drop-down menu. So LI. You can put multiple ones in there. We actually only need one. But the contents of this item are different depending if we are logged in or logged out. If we are logged in, we want to show the logout button. And if we are logged out, we want to show the login button, right? So we add an expression here again with a ternary operator. If we have a user, then we want to render a button that says sign out. If the user is not logged in, then we want to render a button that says sign in. And then we give both of these buttons on-click handlers. This is why we had to make this a client component, because we can only use on-click with JavaScript. And in here we pass an arrow function like this. And in order to sign out, we can call this sign out function, which is coming from Next.js. So we add this import here. And we call this function. We can also configure this between curly braces, and we can say, when we are logged out, we want to be redirected back to the front page. So we can set the callback URL to the home page. And to sign in, we also pass an on-click handler with an anonymous function, which simply calls sign in. Now, instead of these functions, we could also use links because there are specific URLs where we can navigate the user to, so they also get to the Next.js login screen. The benefit of using the sign in function rather than the sign in URL endpoint is that this automatically redirects us to the previous page after signing in. So if we are on a product page and we sign in, we get redirected to the product page and not to the home page. And the same is the case for sign out by default, but here we have changed this behavior by setting the callback URL explicitly. You can remove this if you want. Okay, let's format and save this, and now we only have to add this user menu button to our navbar, and then login should work. I just realized one little mistake. I want this not to be a BG blue, but BG base 100. This is the correct value. Okay, then we open the navbar tsx file, and we want to put the user menu button right next to the shopping cart button. And it's already styled correctly. But this expects the session as input, right? Which we want to fetch here in our navbar. Because again, the navbar is a server component, and this way we can fetch the session before the page is actually opened. So here at the top, we create a const session. We call await get server session. This is a function from Next.js that we can use in server components to get a session of the logged in user from the database. Now to this get server session, we also have to pass the auth options. Where is this coming from? Those are the Next.js options that we set up in our route handler earlier. This is why we export them here, because we have to pass them to get server session, otherwise this will not work. Okay, so this way we get the session of the currently logged in user from the database. And the way this works is that Next.js sets an encrypted cookie in the browser of the user to identify the correct session in the database and know if they are logged in or not. And then we simply pass the session to our user menu button and save this. And now on our website, when we refresh the page, we should see our user menu button. And there it is. We are currently not logged in. So we see these 3 little dots, which are the SVG we pasted. And now let's try this out. Let's log in by clicking sign in. By default, we get to this screen here. You can customize this screen or replace it for a completely different one. This is explained in the Next.js documentation, but for our project here, this is fine. Sign in with Google. And then I want to sign in with one of my accounts. Then we get redirected back to the page. And this error happens because we are trying to load the profile picture from googleusercontent.com, but this will only work if we allow this address in our next config file. So we go into our project, open nextconfig.js, and here we already allow images from unsplash.com, right? So here we want to add a second entry. So a comma, another pair of curly braces, and we set the host name to this one here. Let's actually copy this, put it here. Maybe the address is different for you. Copy whatever you see here as the host name. We save this and we restart the development server with npm run dev, but we should still be logged in, I think. So let's refresh the page. And there we are. And this is the profile picture of my Google account, which you can also see up here. And this user information is now stored in the database. Let's refresh this. Here we have the user, Florian Walter, with the image from Google. And in the accounts collection, there is all the information about this Google account. Now, right now, a user account doesn't have their own shopping cart yet. We still have our anonymous shopping cart that's connected to the cookie. We will set up user shopping carts in the next section, and then we will also merge the anonymous cart with the user's cart when we log in. Let's check if logout works as well. So I click on sign out, and we are logged out. Let's log in again, sign in with Google, coding and flow recording account. And we are logged in. Really cool. And again, since we fetched the user server side in our navbar, when we refresh the page, the user is there immediately. There is no glitch in the UI, there is no loading state. We have the user and the shopping cart both available as soon as the page is opened. But to see that we are actually authenticated, let's add some protection to our add product page. We make it so that not anyone can open this page. Instead, we have to be logged in to add a product. Of course, in a real app, you probably want to make this available only for an administrator. But here we will just add simple authentication protection. So the add product page is a server component, right? This means we can fetch our session with get server session again, to which again we have to pass the auth options. We also have to make this an async function. And then we can simply check if session is undefined or null. Then we want to redirect the user. And we already have this import here from Next Navigation to the sign-in endpoint, which we find under /API /auth/sign-in. And as I explained earlier, by default, when we use the URL instead of the sign-in function, this doesn't redirect us to the page where we were previously at. It redirects us to the front page instead. But we can configure this manually by adding the callback URL param, so question mark, callback URL in camel case spelling like this. And then we want to redirect to /add-product so that we get back to this add product page. So let's try this out. While we are logged in, we should be able to access the add product page. But if we're logged out, we should be redirected to the login page when we try to access the add product page. We get to the login page, we log in, and then we should be redirected to the add product page. So this works. It also makes sense to add a protection to the server action itself in case we are trying to call this while we are not logged in. So here at the top, after use server, We fetch the session here as well with await get server sessions, to which again we pass the auth options. Yeah, we basically want to do the exact same thing as here. If the session is null, we want to redirect the user. But this happens when we click the add product button while we are not logged in. Okay, before we go on, let's also check if our env validation here works. So when I remove an environment variable from the .env file, for example the Google client ID, and then restart the development server, we should see an error message because this will not be able to fetch the user information. Let's try this out. We refresh the page, the session is null, and we get this sort error, which is caused because it's trying to pass the env schema with the process.env files, but since the Google client ID is missing, this throws an error with a very readable error message. We immediately see what is wrong, and we don't accidentally continue with an undefined value. So this works as well. Let's add the Google client ID back, restart the development server, and open our page again. Okay, now let's go into our card.ts file in the lib folder again and adapt our getCard and createCard functions to our new user authentication. Let's start with createCard. So right now we only create an anonymous card that's not connected to a specific user, right? So in here, let's fetch the session. Const session equals await get server session. We can use get server session here because we only call createCard from server components. Again, we have to pass the auth options here. And then instead of creating the new card variable here, we delete the const, and instead above we create a let new card, which is of type card. That's the type coming from the Prisma client. This is the same type we get back when we call card.create. It's an unpopulated card. Okay, then below we want to check if we are logged in. So we check if session has a value. If it doesn't have a value, then we want to create our anonymous card as before. So we paste in this part, and we also paste in the code that creates the cookie. If we are logged in, we also want to create a new card, but this one will be tied to a user account. So again, await prisma.card.create. Then we pass data. And here we want to set the user ID to session.user.id. Now the ID is by default not contained in the user object because Next.auth doesn't return it to us by default. We have to add this ourselves. So let's just write ID here for now. This gives us an error. We go into our route handler. So this Next.auth route file we created earlier. And here we can change what data we want to return in the user object by adding a callback. So under providers, we add this callbacks field to which we pass curly braces. And in here we get auto-completion. We can use this session callback, which will be triggered whenever we return a session from the database. And here we can hook into this process and modify what data we get back. We can also destructure these params here. So we remove params and add curly braces instead. And in here we want to have the session and the user object. And then we can say we want to set session.user.id to the ID that's contained in this user object. This way we take the ID of the user in our database and add it to the session so that we can access it here. But TypeScript doesn't recognize that there is an ID field on this session user. In JavaScript this will just work, but in TypeScript we also have to configure this type here. Before we do this, let's finish this function. At the end we have to return this session so that we can use it in our app. To fix this problem here, we have to extend this user type. For this, we go into our folder and outside of src this time. So right here with all these configuration files, we want to create a new folder, which we call add types. This is a naming convention for type files. In here we put a new file that we call next.d.ts. D.ts files are TypeScript declaration files, and here we can make changes to existing types. And in here we write declare module, and as a string we write next of, because this is the library where we want to make changes to a type, curly braces, and we want to change the session interface. So we want to change this session object, which contains the user, but the user doesn't have an ID. So in interface session we write user colon, again a pair of curly braces, and in here we put the ID value that we want to add to this user. It's of type string, but we also want to have all the other values that are on the user available by default, because when we write it this way, now the user only has an ID. To also add these other values back to the user, we go after the closing curly brace here, write an ampersand sign to create an intersection type, and then we use default session from next of, to which we add square brackets, and in here we write user as a string. So this way we extend this next of user and add this ID field to it. Let's reformat this and save it. And now our errors here disappeared. And now in our card file in the lib folder, we also don't have an error anymore. Now the ID of the user is added to the user in the session when we return a session. Okay, so now when we call create card, it checks if the user is logged in. If yes, it creates a card connected to this user. If not, it creates an anonymous card like before. Now let's scroll up to create card and do the same here as well. In the first line, we want to retrieve the session. Then we want to create a variable for this card here. So we remove the const here. Instead, we create a let card. But this card we fetch here is populated with the product information, right? With these include options we used here. So the return type of this is card with products, the type that we created earlier. So let card with products or null if we don't have a card yet, and we initialize this with null. Then again we check if we have a session or not. If we don't have a session, we want to do the same as before. We want to fetch the cookie with the local card ID and fetch this anonymous card. If we have a session, we want to fetch the card of this user. So card equals await prisma.card.find first. This time it's not find unique because a user can have multiple cards, but here we only support one card. So we use find first. And in curly braces, we add the filters. We want to fetch the card where the user ID in the card, that's part of the schema that we modified earlier. So a card now has a user ID, which is optional. We want to find the card where the user ID is the ID of the currently logged in user, comma, and of course we want to include the same populated card item data. And the rest stays the same, right? So let's try this out. When I refresh the page, we should see an empty card because there is no card connected to this user account yet, right? So I have to start the development server again. Refresh the page, and the card is empty. Now we should be able to add an item to the card. It creates a card for this particular user. When we log out, we should see the anonymous card again. So that's the anonymous card. And when we log in, we should see this user's card again. And we should also see two cards in our database. There they are. One has a user ID, the other doesn't. Okay, cool, so this is working. Now let's implement the logic that merges the anonymous card with the user's card when we log in. This is also how it works on Amazon. So you are logged out, you add some items to your cart, and then you log into your account. These items are moved into your user card. For this, let's create a new function here in our lib folder in our cart.ts file. Let's put it at the bottom. Export async function. And I'm gonna call it merge anonymous card into user card. It's a very long name, but it's very descriptive. And to this function, we pass the ID of the user that we want to merge the card into. And here we have to write a little bit of logic. The first step is we want to fetch the local card if one exists. First we need a cookie, just like in getCard. Let's copy this line, put it here. Okay, and we also want to get the local card from the database, right? So let's copy this part here as well, where we assign local card. We create a const card where we assign this to. And we need to populate the items because we want to merge these items together. So we need to know which items are in the card, but we don't need the product information because this is not necessary to merge these cards. So what we do is we remove this part here, include product true, and just write true instead. This populates the items field, but it doesn't populate the card items with the product information. Instead, they will only contain the quantity and the product ID. Let's also rename this variable to local card. And if there is no local card, then there's nothing to merge, right? So below we check if exclamation mark local card, we just run a return. If there is a local card, then next we need the user's card. So we create a const user card equals await prisma dot card dot find first again. Again, because a user can have multiple cards, so this doesn't work with find unique, where the user IDs match with the user ID value we pass to this function. And again, we want to include the card items in here, but we don't need the product information. Okay, and then we want to merge the items of the user card with the anonymous card. Then we want to delete all the currently existing items in the user card and replace them for these merged items. And then finally, we also want to delete the anonymous card so that it's empty again. So we have to do several database operations. Now what we have to keep in mind is, what happens if we get an error somewhere in the middle? For example, what happens if we delete the items from the user card, but we get an error before we insert the new items and then the user card is suddenly empty? This is why we want to execute all of this in a transaction. A database transaction is a process where you can do multiple operations, but if one of them fails, the whole transaction will be rolled back and none of the changes will be applied. And I think pretty much all types of databases support transactions, including MongoDB. And to execute a transaction with Prisma, we go below and we write await prisma.transaction, and it starts with a $sign. This is the function name. To this function, we can pass an async function where we execute the actual transaction. And this async function gets passed an argument, which is again a Prisma client, but every operation we call on this Prisma client in here will be part of the transaction. And in the documentation, they call this TX, which I guess stands for transaction. So we add this argument here. And again, TX is just a Prisma client on which we can do our usual operations. Now, before we set up this transaction, we have to create another function below outside of merge anonymous card into user card. This function will contain the actual logic that merges the items in these two cards. So we call it merge card items. And to this function, we pass the user card and the anonymous card, right? But I wrote the function in a way that we can pass any arbitrary number of cards to it. So if you want to merge 3 cards for whatever reason in the future, then this will work as well. For this, we use this syntax where we start the argument with 3 dots. This way we create so-called var args, meaning that we can pass as many of these arguments to this function as we want. And we call these arguments card items. And the type of this var arg argument is an array of card items from the Prisma client. But then we add another array because we can pass as many of these card item arrays as we want, as I just explained. So this is an array of card items. And in here we want to take each entry of these 2 cards and combine them together. So if one has a quantity of 1 and one has a quantity of 2, then we want a quantity of 3. And if the anonymous card contains items that are not in the user card yet, then we want to add them. But instead of writing this out by hand, I just copy paste this here. You can pause the video and type this out. This is nothing new, it's just a bit complicated. It uses the reduce function and a for each loop to go through each of the card items and then combine the quantities. To be honest, I had GitHub Copilot write this logic for me. GitHub Copilot, in case you don't know, is an AI plugin for VS Code. It's very useful to create boilerplate code like this automatically. But all of this still makes sense. So if you go through this step by step, then you will understand what exactly is happening here. Again, just take a moment, type this out, and then we can continue our transaction here. So in the transaction, we want to check if the user card exists. If it exists, we want to merge it with the anonymous card. If it doesn't exist, we want to create a completely new user card, right? So we check if user card. We do this inside the transaction. And let's also add the else block right away so we don't get confused by the nesting later. If there is a user card, we want to use our merge card items function to merge the anonymous card with the user card. So we create a const, let's call it merged with a D, card items. And for this we call our merge card items function, to which we pass local card.items, and user card.items. Again, since we made this a var arg, we can pass as many of these card item arrays as we want. So this now contains the merged card items. The next step is to delete the existing items in the user card and then put these newer merged card items in there instead. So we call await tx, which is this Prisma client on which we do the transaction operations, card item dot delete many. And in the filter, we define which ones we want to delete with this where value. And in here, we want to compare the card ID to the user card.id, because we want to delete all card items that belong to this user card and then put our new merged card items in there. So below we write await tx.carditem.create menu. And for the data, we want to pass the merged card items, not merge card items because that's the name of the function, merged card items, which is our new array up here. Now each of these merged card items also contains the ID of this card item in the database it had before. But we are making new database entries here and we want a new auto-generated ID, so we want to ignore this ID field. We only care about these other 3 fields. We can do this by mapping these merged card items. So again, in the map function, we get passed each item. We add parentheses and curly braces because these curly braces are not the block of this function. They are the return value, the JavaScript object that we want to return. This is why we have to wrap this into parentheses. And as I said, in here, we want to put the card ID, which is usercard.id. We want to set the product ID to item.productID. And we want to set a quantity to item.quantity. So now we put these merged card items in here, but we ignore the IDs to create a completely new ID. And we also set the card ID of all of these items to the user card ID, which is important because the anonymous items didn't have a card ID before, right? So we have to set this here. And that's the ID of the card we found in the database, the existing card. And in the else block, it means we don't have an existing user card yet, and we want to create one. So await tx.card.create. In here we pass the data as usual, curly braces. We want to set the user ID of this card to the user ID we pass to this function, so we pass this as the first argument. Again, this is a shorthand for writing user ID colon user ID, but the value and the key have the same name, so we can use the short syntax like this. Then we want to put the items in here. Items colon. And this is a so-called relation query in Prisma. This way we can create a card in the card collection, but at the same time we can create card items in the card items collection in one operation, and they will automatically be connected together by adding the card ID to these items. Then in here we call create menu to create several card items. And I know that this can look complicated at first, but you just have to work through this because this is how you write these database operations. And here we have to pass data again, for which we want to pass the local card.items. This time it's not the merged card items because in this else block a user card doesn't exist yet, meaning there are no user card items, there are only local card items. But again we want to map this into the correct structure. Again we get past each item and we return a new JavaScript object for each of them. Now since we do this relation query where we do the operation over the card and not the card item, we don't have to set the card ID this time. This is automatically handled by this operation. Instead, this time we only need the product ID and the quantity. And the card ID will be set automatically. Okay, and after merging the cards has completed, we want to delete the local card and also delete the cookie. So we do this below this whole if block here, still inside the transaction. So if user card, else, and below this else block, we write await tx, we are still inside the transaction, .card.delete. We want to delete the card where the ID of the card is the local card ID, the local card that we fetched from our cookie. We want to delete this one and then we want to remove the cookie, which we do with cookies.set, the same name, local card ID, and then we set this to an empty string. This is how you delete a cookie in Next.js. Okay, maybe let's recap this whole function one more time. We fetch the local card from this cookie. If there is no local card, then we return because there is no data that we have to merge into the user card. If there is a local card, then we fetch the user card from the database. If there is no user card in the database yet, then we just have to create a new one with the items contained in the local card. And if there's already a user card and a local card, then we merge these items and add them all to the user card. And at the end, we delete the local card because we don't need it anymore. We have merged it into the user's card. Okay, this function is ready, but now the question is where do we call our merge function here? We want to call this right after we have logged in. So before the page is opened, the merging already happened, and as usual, when we see the page, all the data is already displayed correctly and there is no loading state. So let's go into our next auth route handler again. We have this callback here that will be called every time we return a session. And below callbacks, we can also add this events field. And in here we can get called every time we did a certain auth operation. For example, we have this sign in function here. And this is the perfect place to merge our cards because this will be called right after we have signed in, but before we are returned to our home page. We want to make this an async function because our merge card functions makes database operations. And we want to destructure this argument here. We need this user value to get the user ID. And in here we simply call await merge anonymous card into user card which expects the user ID that we can get out of this user. This is the user that just signed in. Okay, let's try this out. So, the logged in user has one item in the cart right now, these shoes for 95 bucks. Let's sign out. In the anonymous cart we have the headphones and this bar stool. And now when we log in, these carts should be merged and we should have 3 items in there. Let's try this out. Sign into our account. Now the sign in callback is fired, which merges the carts. And there we are. We have our user cart with the 3 items in there. And when we log out again, we should see an empty cart because we cleared the anonymous cart. This is, by the way, also how Amazon handles it. Let's try this one more time. Let's put something into the anonymous cart. Maybe 2 of these plants here. And again, this weird glitch doesn't happen in production. It only happens in development. So now we have 2 of these plants in here. Again, we log in. And these items will be merged into the user cart. And this all works. Isn't this cool? Now let's also try if our transaction works properly. As I explained, if we have an error here somewhere inside this transaction, none of these operations should be applied. Let's try this out by throwing an error here at the very end of the transaction. Throw error, test. Just for a moment, obviously we will remove this later. So now I do the same process again. I log out, I add this cart to the shopping cart, but now when we log in and execute our merge function, it will fail because of this error. But the error is thrown at the very end, after all these operations. But since these operations are part of a transaction, they shouldn't be applied when this error occurs within the transaction. So let's see. We log in again. We should see this error in the console. There it is, error test. Our user card still only has 5 items because this merging failed. And this 1 item is still in our anonymous card. So the website still works, but these cards are not merged, but they are also not left in an inconsistent state. So this is a really professional setup. Alright, let's not forget to remove this error here. Maybe I will leave this as a comment. One more thing I want to mention is whenever we fetch cookies, like we do when we either get the anonymous card or also inside get server session, then the route that uses this function is automatically dynamically rendered. This is important because when we show the card of the user, this data is different for each individual user, right? So we don't want to cache this page on our backend and serve the exact same page to each user. Every user has their own card. But we don't have to configure this cache ourselves because again, whenever we get cookies, which we do here, but which is also done inside get server session, then the page is rendered dynamically, automatically. So it fetches new data whenever we open the page and it's not cached between users. This is where we don't have to add revalidate 0 to our card page, for example. This happens automatically because we retrieve the card here. And to verify this, we can actually build the project with npm run build, which takes a moment. This builds this project for production mode. And here we can see from these icons how these pages are rendered and cached. So this lambda symbol here means that the page is not cached. Instead, it's created every time the page is opened. And when we look at the card route here, we see this lambda symbol. So this page is not statically cached, which is good. Okay, this was a tough part, but I think we learned a lot. And in the next section, we will implement pagination here for our front page, so that we don't show all products at once. Okay, so to have enough items that we can actually paginate, let's go to the add product page again, which now requires authentication. That's good. And then let's add a bunch of newer products, but let's do so in a loop so that we don't have to repeat this process like 50 times. Let's go to the add product page code. And then just for this one operation, I will put a loop in here. So let's say for I, and let's just put, I don't know, 50 items in here. And then I want to repeat this process here and create the exact same item in the database 50 times, just so that we can later see our full pagination bar with many pages in action. So let's save this. Then we need an image again. As usual, we take this from Unsplash. I'm going to use this clone trooper here, because what would be more fitting for 50 items with the exact same data than a clone trooper. So I paste the image URL here, call this clone trooper, description, this is a cool clone trooper, we have many of them. Of course this data here doesn't matter. And the price will be, I don't know, $19.99. Now we should execute this in this loop and add the same item 50 times, right? So this will take a moment to complete. Okay, let's refresh the page. And now we have this clone trooper in here 50 times. Let's also remove the for loop again, because obviously we don't want to keep this. And then we want to paginate this front page here, because if we have a lot of items in our database, we don't want to show all of them at once. We want to show them in pages. So let's go into our project and set up a pagination bar. We will put this into the components folder, because you will likely reuse this in different places. Paginationbar.tsx. As usual, the styling of this component is coming from Daisy UI. This is how it looks. And in this file, we export a default function, which we also call pagination bar. And this component also needs props. Pagination bar props. We need the current page, so that we can highlight this element in the pagination bar and also make it not clickable, which will be a number. And we of course need a total number of pages, so that we know how many items to show in this pagination bar. Then we add these props down here and destructure them. Current page, total pages. Now in this pagination bar, I don't want to show all pages at once, because if we have 100 pages, for example, then we don't want to show all the numbers from 1 to 100 here, right? We only want to show a subset of these numbers. For this, we will write some logic that calculates these page numbers. You can just follow along. We create a const max page, that's the largest page number that will be shown in our pagination bar. We assign this to math.min, which returns the smallest of the values we pass to this function. To this we pass total pages, comma, and then math.max, which is the opposite of math.min. And here we pass current page plus 4, comma 10. So the max page will be the current page plus 4. So if we are on page 13, for example, the largest page number will be 17. However, if we are on page 1, for example, then there will be no pages to the left of page 1, right? Because there are no smaller pages. In this case, I want to show all the page numbers all the way up to 10. Otherwise, the pagination bar would be very small. Also, if there is no current page plus 4, because we are on page 17, for example, and there are only 18 total pages, then we want to use the total pages instead. This is why we wrap this into math.min. I know this is a bit complicated at first, but you can just play around with this and see how this behaves. Then we also create a const min page, for which we use math.max 1, comma, math.min, and to math.min we pass current page minus 5 or max page minus 9, like this. Again, this calculates an appropriate value for the min page that is not smaller than 1, and I just came up with this by playing around and see what looks good. And then we want to generate page items from the min page all the way up to the max page. We do this in a loop. So we create another for loop. Let's call the index page. We start at min page. So we replace the 0 for min page. And we want to run this until page is less than or equal to the max page. And then inside this loop, we want to add page items to an array. So above the loop, let's create this array. Const numbered page items. This will be of type JSX element array because this contains JSX elements. And we initialize this with an empty array. And then in the loop, for each round, we can say numbered page items.push to put a new element in here. And each page item will be a link. So we use a next link here. The text of the link will be the current page number, which is the index of the loop. And then we configure the link itself. So we add an href. And what we do is we navigate to the current page, but we append this page URL query param with a question mark, page equals, plus the current page number. So this adds this page query param to the current destination, and we can read the page from the URL in our server component. And then since we are in a loop, we also have to add a key to each element, for which we can just use the page number. And then we also want to add a class name to each link. We make this an expression with curly braces and add a backtick string in here. The first class we need for all of these items is this join item class, which is used in Daisy UI for these pagination bar items. And we also use the button class btn. Then we put an expression in here with a $sign and curly braces. And what I want to do is I want to disable the currently selected page item so that we can't even click it. So it has a different styling, but we will also not make it clickable. We can do this with a class, but we want to apply this class conditionally. So in this expression, we check if the current page is equal to the page of this item, then question mark, ternary operator, we want to apply another class in quotation marks. We want to apply btn active, which changes the highlighting color of this item. And then I also want to make this element unclickable, for which we can use the pointer minus events minus none class, which is coming from Tailwind. Then we add the second half of the ternary operator, colon. If this item is not the current page, we don't want to add an additional class, so we just pass an empty string here. Okay, and then we create the pagination bar itself in the return statement. So in here we put a div, to which we add the class name join. That's the counterpart of join item. This connects these items visually. And in this div we want to render our numbered page items, right? Let's see how this looks. Let's go to our front page, and before we actually fetch the count of pages and items we have, let's just hard code this pagination bar in here for now, just to see how it looks. So we have our pagination bar. Let's set the current page to 3 and the total pages to a large number, 99. And then see how this looks. There it is. Let's center this on the screen by adding some class names to the outer div. We add flex, flex col, and item center, which should center everything, including the pagination bar. So we see the pages from 1 to 10. If I set the current page to 13, you can see the responsive page numbers in action. Now the smallest value is 8, the largest one is 17, and we never show all 99 pages at once because that would be too many. But our pagination bar is still not fully responsive. If the screen width is too small, then this will not all fit on the screen. So let's make this responsive by switching to a different kind of view. What I want to do is, when the screen is small, I want to switch to this kind of pagination bar, where we just have the current page and a button for left and right. So let's go back into our pagination bar component. And what we can do is, we can hide this div on small screens, or rather on very small screens, by setting this to hidden by default. And then on the SM breakpoint, which are small screens and larger, we want to set the display back to block, so we show it on this screen size and larger. And on these very small screens where we hide these page numbers, we want to show a different element instead. And to put multiple elements into this return block, we can wrap this into such a fragment. Because there always has to be one parent element. And there's no reason to make this a div, because only one of these will be shown. A div would work as well as the wrapper, but I think a fragment is more semantically correct. So below the first div, we put a second div. And here we add the class name join again. On very small screens, we set this to display block by default. And on small screens and larger, this one will be hidden. So only one of these two will be shown, depending on the screen size. And in here we put these elements from Daisy UI I just showed you earlier. So we have this left button, which we only want to show if current page is larger than 1. Because otherwise there is no previous page that we can navigate to, right? So if the current page is larger than 1, we want to render a link. The href again will point to a question mark page equals, and we append current page -1, and we wrap this into parentheses. And this link needs the same join item and btn classes as we used for our numbered page items. So we add the class name here as well, btn and join item. We close this link tag, and as the text we use this left arrow here, which I just copied from Daisy UI. I have no idea how to enter this in a normal keyboard, but I will link this pagination bar again in the video description below, so you can copy it from there. But you can also just use any other icon here. Okay, then we want a button for the current page, right? And then this right arrow. So, below this expression here, where we checked current page larger than 1, we add a button. This doesn't have to be a link because this will be disabled anyway. It will not be clickable. So to this button we add the class names. Again, join item, btn, and pointer events none to make this unclickable. And this will say page and the current page number. Then below the right arrow, we check if current page is less than total pages, because if we are on the last page, then we don't need a right button. In here again we put a link just like this one, so let's actually copy this. Just that we wanna go to a current page +1, and the text in here will be a right arrow. Okay, let's save this and see how this looks. So this is the full pagination bar, and if I make this small enough, eventually it turns into this pagination bar. But we can't try it out yet because we haven't set up pagination here yet. So let's do that next. Let's go to the front page, which is the page.tsx in the app folder. First of all, we need to read the current page out of the URL, because the pagination bar adds this as a URL param, right? So in our page here, we can get the search params from the props. For this we create an interface called home props. And in here we add this search params field. And you have to spell it exactly like this in camel case, because this is how we get the search params out of the URL in Next.js. We need this exact prop name. And this will contain an object with the different search params, and in here we expect our page, which will be a string. This number page is coming from the pagination bar, because this is how we called this search param value here. This has to match. And then we can destructure this page here in the component, home props. Now this is actually not the page yet. It contains the search params, and the search params contain the page. So this is how we destructure this. What we can also do is we can give this a default value of 1 like this as a string, because search params are strings. This way we have a page number to work with even if no query param is added to the URL. And in this case, of course, we want to load the first page. So next we have to turn this page param into a number. So we create a const current page, and then we call parseInt, to which we pass the page param. And even if we don't pass 1, it will be set to 1 as the fallback value. Then we also need to define a page size, and let's store this value in a variable as well. That's good practice, because this way we avoid magic numbers, where we just have numbers in our code that we might not remember what the meaning was. So let's create a const page size, and let's set this to 6. You can also make this larger if you want to deploy this app, but for testing purposes, a small page size is easier to work with. And then we also want to create a number for the hero item count. The hero item is this element here at the top. We have to take this into account when we paginate our results, because we will only show this on the first page. And again, to avoid magic numbers in our code, I store this value in a variable as well. And maybe in the future you want to have more than one of these hero items. Then you have to change this number. Then we need the total number of items in our database so that we can calculate the largest page. So we create a const total item count, and we can get this through Prisma by calling await prisma.product, because this is what we want to count. And then we have this count function here, which returns the total number of products in our database. And from this we can calculate the number of total pages we have, right? So we created const total pages equals, this would be a total item count divided by a page size. But since we have this additional hero item on the first page, we subtract this from the total item count, so minus hero item count. Of course, we have to wrap this part into parentheses, because division takes precedence over subtraction. And this can return a decimal value, so it can return something like 4.5 pages. But we always want to round this up, because if we have 4.5 pages, then we need 5 pages in our pagination bar, right? So we wrap this into another pair of parentheses, and before it we add math.ceil, which rounds this number we pass in here up. So 4.5, for example, will be rounded up to 5. Okay, now we have the number of pages, and now we want to modify our Prisma query to only return the current page. So we keep the order by. We still want to order this with the newest product at the top. And after this, we add the skip field, where we can define how many items we want to skip. Because if we are on page 2, we want to skip all the items of the first page. So we want to skip current page minus 1. So if we are on page 2, we want to skip 1 full page. That's the first page, times the page size, right? Now again, since we have this hero item on the first page, we want to add something to this page size. In parentheses, we want to check if the current page is equal to 1. If we are on the first page, then we don't want to skip any additional items, because we show the hero item. So after a question mark, we write 0. But if we are not on the first page, we want to skip 1, which is the hero item. Actually, we don't want to skip 1, we want to skip hero item count. First of all, this makes it more readable, because again, we avoid this magic number, but this can also now adapt to 2 or more hero items. So now we have defined how many items we want to skip. After this, we add another comma, and also add this take field, which tells Prisma how many items to return for this page. This is obviously the page size, but again we have to account for this hero item. So we add plus If the current page is the first page, question mark, then we want to add hero item count to the page size. Otherwise, we don't want to add this. Okay, now we have all our values here, so we can use them down here in our pagination bar. But I want to render this pagination bar only if we have more than one page. Otherwise, it's a bit unnecessary. So we check if total pages is greater than 1. Only then we want to render this pagination bar. Then for current page, we pass the current page that we passed from the URL. And for total pages, we pass the total pages that we calculated. So now when we save this, we only see 6 items and we are on page 1, right? What happens if we click page 2? We still render our hero item at the top, so down here we only have 5 items now. So we want to hide this hero item if we are not on page 1. So let's scroll up to our hero item right here and render this only if current page is equal to 1. 2 ampersand signs, and we wrap this all around this hero item. But now we still only have 5 items here because we slice the products and we remove the first item. That's the one we were showing in the hero item. So what we do is we remove this whole part and instead we add parentheses, and here we check if current page is equal to 1, then we want to map from products.slice.1 as we did before. But if we are not on the first page, colon, we want to take the whole products array. We don't want to remove the first item if we are on page 2 upwards. So now when we save this, we see 6 items. Let's refresh the page just to make sure that the changes are applied correctly. On page 3, we still see the same 6 items, and eventually we should get to our old items here, these ones. All of them show 6 items except for the first page, which shows this additional hero item at the top. So this works correctly. And the currently selected page is contained in the URL. This is basically how you can maintain state in server components. Server components don't have real state, they can't use state, but they can put information in the URL, like the page number. And when you use search params in a server component, like we are doing here, then this page is automatically dynamically rendered. Meaning every time we open this page or refresh it, we get the latest data and it's not cached. This is because Next.js recognizes that we are reading the search params, which are dynamic. Next.js can't know in advance which search params we are passing here. For example, it can't know which page we are trying to open. So if we added new products to our database, they will always be shown here, even if we don't compile the project again in production. This has the same effect as adding export const. We validate equals 0, which I explain in my Next.js beginner course. This also makes this page dynamically rendered, but again, search params does this automatically. And this is also the behavior we want here, usually. Because when you add new products to your database, you usually want to show these changes immediately, right? Okay, so our page is already very professional. Next, I want to implement this search functionality here. So the search field itself already works, right? We have already implemented this. So if I search for Trooper, for example, we get redirected to the search page and we add this query as a query param. We just haven't set up the page itself yet. So let's do that next. So we create a new page. In the app directory, first we have to create a folder. Search, that's the relative URL that we navigate to, and then here we put a page tsx as usual. And then we export the default function, which we call search page. And just like on the front page, we want to get the search params out of the URL because this contains the search query. So we create an interface, search page props. In here again, we need the search params with this exact spelling. And this time in here, we expect the query. which is a string. And then here we want to get the search params out of the props. And out of these search params, we want to get the query. And then we want to fetch these results out of the database. So we turn this into an async function. This is just a normal server component. And in here we create a const products and call await prisma dot product dot find menu. We want to return multiple products. And then we add our filter here, where colon curly braces, and I want to search in both the name and the description of the product. So we can use this OR operator in all uppercase, to which we can pass an array with multiple queries. And only one of these queries has to match. So we add them between curly braces. First we want to search in the name of the product. So we write name colon curly braces, and then we have this contains comparator here. We want to find this if the name contains the query, and the query is the search query that we get out of the URL. And then after contains query, we add the comma and we set the mode to insensitive, which is a string. This makes the search case insensitive. So it doesn't matter if our query contains uppercase or lowercase letters, this will always find the same results. Then we add a comma at the end and we duplicate this line to add another entry to our OR array here. Just that this time we want to search in the description. And again, since this is wrapped into OR, only one of these has to match. And I also want to order these results. So after the where down here, we add order by colon curly braces. Again, we want to order by ID in descending order. Again, the ID contains a timestamp. So we have our data, and now we want to render this in the UI. First of all, I want to check if products.length is equal to 0. Then we want to return a div that says no products found. And I want to render this text on the screen. So I add a class name text sender, which again is coming from Tailwind. So this is an early return in case there are no products that match this query. If there are products, we want to return them in a list. So below we add another return statement. We wrap this into a div. Inside this div we want to map our products. Products.map. As usual, we get passed each product. And we want to render the same product card that we also use on the front page. So to this product card we have to pass the product and a key with the product ID. We also want to style this grid properly, so we can copy these class names here from the front page product card grid. Except for the MI4 one, we can copy these. You can also type them out by hand if you prefer. And we add them to this div here. So let's save this and see how this looks. We are still on the search page, right? Let's refresh this just to be sure. And here are our results. You can paginate them as well if you want. I didn't bother implementing pagination here, but you already know how this works. Let's search for something else, like stool, and it finds our bar stool. Of course, you can customize the search to your preferences. Okay, I also want to add a title to this page, and I want this title to depend on the search query. So to make this dynamic, we export the function generate metadata. Again, the spelling has to be exact. As we already know, this can take the same props as the page itself. So we pass the search page props and get the query out of here. This function will return metadata. This time we don't have to wrap this into a promise because this will not be fetched asynchronously. We don't need to do a database operation here. We just want to use the query itself in the title. So I want to set the title tour, backtick string, search column. Then I put the query in here, and then our usual dash flowmason at the end. Yeah, of course there should be no colon after return. So now this says search colon, then the query we typed in, and then flowmason. Really cool. So feature-wise our app is finished, but we still have to deploy it, and there are some additional steps we have to take. But there is one other thing I want to change first, and this will require us to implement a Prisma extension. Prisma extension is a brand new feature that just became available. And this is a very interesting topic that you don't want to skip here, so make sure to watch this tutorial all the way to the end. The fact that we can create anonymous shopping carts is really cool, but one problem this creates is that we might accumulate a lot of abandoned shopping carts in our database. Because a user can create an anonymous shopping cart but then delete the cookie, for example. Or maybe they were using the incognito tab, which doesn't store cookies across sessions. And once this cookie is deleted, there is no connection to the shopping cart in the database anymore, and also no way for the user to retrieve it anymore. Instead, the next time they add an item to their cart, they create a completely newer shopping cart. So it might be a good idea to delete these abandoned shopping carts from the database from time to time. For this we can check the updated add timestamp of the cart together with the user ID. We can, for example, say, okay, if a cart doesn't belong to a user, so if it doesn't have a user ID and it hasn't been updated in a while, then we want to delete it. And then you can also go through the cart items and delete all cart items that belong to the cart that you just deleted. The problem is, right now when we update our cart items in our server actions, the updated add timestamp of the cart is not updated, because we are doing these updates directly over the cart item model. Now we can change this and use a relation query, as we already did before. We use a relation query in our merge cart function. Down here where we create a cart and the cart items in one operation. This is a so-called relation query because we create cart items over this cart model here. So we create two models at the same time. In our server actions we can do the same. Instead of doing the operation on the cart item, we change this query. So let's start with cart item.delete in the server action file of the shopping cart page. So instead of cart item delete, we can write await Prisma and do it over the cart model. But we don't want to delete a cart, we want to delete the cart items. So on the cart itself, we are doing an update. Parentheses, curly braces. We have fetched the cart that we are updating. So we can say we want to update the cart where ID is equal to the cart ID. And then we add this data field that contains the actual update values. And in here we want to update the items, which are the cart items that belong to the cart with this ID. So this will find the items with this cart ID in the cart items collection. And in here we can add the delete operation. And then ID colon article in cart.id. Article in cart is what we filtered up here. So this now does the same thing as this operation down here. It's a bit longer, but now this delete operation is routed over our cart model. And this later allows us to update the updated add timestamp of the shopping cart, of which we change the cart items to the latest date, so that we always know when was the last time we made changes to the items of this cart. So now we also delete this operation down here, we don't need it anymore. And we replace the other two as well. So here we are updating cart items. To do it over the cart, we write await prisma.cart.update again. Again, we use this where filter. And for the data, we pass items colon curly braces again. This time we want to do an update operation. Again, we need our filter in here, where ID is article in cart.id. Again, comma, and again data with the update values. And we want to update the quantity, just like we did down here. So let's delete this operation as well, because we have replaced it. And one more below. Again, await prisma.card.update. Again with the same filter. Data. This time we want to create card items. So again, items, colon, curly braces, create, and then the create body, which contains the same values as down here. The product ID and the quantity. And then we delete this operation. Now let's also do the same in the other server actions file, where we have these two operations. Let's replace them as well. So await prisma.card.update. Again, we paste our where filter and add the data here. We want to update the items, and on the items we want to do an update operation with the same filters as down here. So we can copy this part and paste it here. And then we delete this old operation. And one more, then we should be done. Await prisma.card.update, where the card ID is this one, and then data, items, and in the future you want to do all your card item updates over the card model to keep this updated add timestamp up to date. And in here we write create, and then we can copy paste this payload here and delete this operation. Let's save it. Oh, there's one more in the card.ts file in the lib folder. We have these two operations here, but since we do them one after another in a transaction, it's enough if we make one of them an update on the card model. So let's keep card item delete many and replace card item create many. So await, this time it's this tx prisma client .card.update, where the ID is the user card.id. That's the one we are updating. And the local card gets deleted. Data colon, we want to update the card items. We want to execute the create many operation. And you get auto completion here, by the way. This helps you with coming up with these operations. And then we want to copy this part down here. But we can delete the line with the card ID. Since we are doing this operation over the card model, this will be set automatically in this nested update. And then we can delete the create many operation below. So now we are doing all our card item updates over the card model. Unfortunately, this still doesn't update the updated add timestamp, because this by default is only updated if we actually make changes to a card document, so to a value in here. There is an active discussion on GitHub about updating this updated add timestamp of the parent document when we do a nested query like we are doing here. So in the future there might be a setting that you can change to enable this so that the updated add timestamp of the card is updated automatically, even when we only update the card items. But right now this doesn't work yet and we have to find our own workaround. Now one way to handle this would be to just add the updated add timestamp to our update operation and set this to a dates.now, to the current timestamp. But of course this is very tedious because we have to remember to do this in every single update operation and we might forget this somewhere. Now a solution I came up with to fix this is to use a Prisma client extension. This is a brand new feature available for Prisma. Client extensions allow us to hook into queries, for example, and then do something in there which will be executed every time we do an operation. For this, let's go into our prisma.ts file where we initialize our Prisma client. And then let's use such an extension to automatically update the updated add timestamp whenever we do an update operation on the card. So what we do is we remove this export from the default Prisma client and we rename it with F2 to Prisma base. And down here we also assign Prisma base to global for Prisma. But the Prisma client that we want to export from this file is the extended one. So below we write export const Prisma, then we take our Prisma base and call this $extends function on there, with which we can create a client extension. In here we have this query key, with which we can hook into the query operations. So colon, curly braces, we want to hook into the queries of the card. So card, colon, curly braces, and in here we want to make a change to the update query, because update is what we use in all our server actions when we make changes to the card items. And this argument here should be an async function. So we write async update, parentheses, curly braces, and in here we can destructure arguments, and autocompletion should help us. We need the args and the query. The args contain the actual body of the update, so the data that we are passing. And to this we want to add the updated else timestamp. So in here we can make changes to args.data. Then we assign this to a JavaScript object. In here we spread the existing args.data to keep all the update operations in here, comma, and additionally we also want to update the updated else timestamp. And we want to set this to a newer date, which gives us the current timestamp. And then below we have to return the query, to which we pass these updated args. Okay, and this is how we create a Prisma client extension. Let's format this, let's save it, and then our route handler here complains. That's our next auth route handler. It doesn't recognize our extended client as a Prisma client anymore. They will probably fix this typing in the future. Again, this is a very new feature, but we can get around this by casting this to a Prisma client from @prisma/client, like this. This way we tell TypeScript, relax, this is a normal Prisma client. Again, in the future, it might not be necessary to use a client extension if they add an option to automatically update the updated add timestamp, even if we don't make a change to the card document itself. But right now we have to go this detour. So let's try this out. In our database, we have this one card, right? The updated add timestamp is currently still the same as the created add timestamp because we haven't changed anything in this document. Even though we added and we updated card items, the updated add timestamp still has the default value. But now with our new changes, when I make an update to the card, this updated add timestamp should change. So I change the quantity of an item, for example. Let's update this, and you can see the new timestamp. Let's try it one more time. Maybe let's add a new item, a clone trooper. And again, right now this is 6:50:18. And after refreshing this, this updates to the current time. So now what you can do is you can set up a cron job. So a task that runs after a certain time interval regularly. For this you can use Vercel cron jobs because we will deploy this project to Vercel. And this way you can execute a route handler, so a server endpoint from time to time, which then checks all your anonymous cards. It checks when they were last updated, and if they haven't been updated for a while, it deletes the card and the card items that belong to this card. And the cards that have a user ID belong to a user, so you usually don't want to delete them at all, because they are tied to a user account. We won't implement this in this tutorial, you can figure this out yourself. You can also keep the abandoned card items in the database if you want. I just wanted to show you how you can update the updated add timestamp so that you know which cards to delete. Okay, now it's time to deploy our project to production so that we can actually open our website over the internet. And as usual, the easiest way to deploy a Next.js project is via Vercel, which is a hosting provider and also the company that created and maintains Next.js. So as you can imagine, Vercel is really optimized to deploy a Next.js project, and all these features like server components and server actions will just work. To deploy our project, we first have to push it to GitHub. You can do this right in VS Code over the source control tab. Here you want to push your project to a GitHub repository. This repository can be private, doesn't have to be public. And then you want to sign up on Vercel and connect it to your GitHub account. Because then we can just click on Add New and add a new project. And this shows us all our projects on our GitHub account. Right now I'm logged into Coding and Flow. And here I can just click on Import and add the Next.js e-commerce project. However, before we deploy this, we have to make a few more preparations. First of all, we go back into our project and open the package.json. Here we have to add a post install script. This is described in the Prisma documentation. Otherwise, if we try to deploy this project on Vercel, we will get an error. This is explained here. It happens because of the way Vercel caches the Prisma client. We have to add this post install script here in our package.json. So this goes into the scripts block like this. Then we want to push this change to our main branch. So add Prisma post install script. Commit and push. Then we also go into our Atlas backend. Go to the Network Access tab, where right now we only allow connections from our local host, right? So we click on Add IP address, and in order to be able to connect from Vercel, we have to allow access from anywhere, which adds this 0 IP address. Because Vercel uses serverless functions, we don't have our own server machine with a single IP address. Instead, this IP address can change, so we have to allow access from anywhere, but our database is still protected by the password. So this doesn't mean anyone can make changes to our database. We still need the correct password. So we confirm this. Then let's go back to Vercel and import our project here. So we click on Import. It automatically recognizes that this is a Next.js project. We don't have to change any build and output settings, but we need to add our environment variables. So in here we put the same env variables that we have in our .env file. The database URL, which is the same as here. Then we click on Add, and then we can add another one. Google Client ID, add client secret, we don't have a next.arf URL yet because we don't know our URL in advance. Vercel actually gives us a free URL under .vercel.app. But I don't know this one in advance, so I'm gonna add a placeholder here, http:// and I'm just gonna write placeholder.com. I think this will work. We will later replace this with the actual URL we get from Vercel. And the next.arf secret, which again is just any random combination of characters. So I just type in a new one here. Click on Add, and then we click on Deploy and hope that this works. This will take a minute or so. That's me in the corner. That's me in the spotlight. Oh, and it worked. Nice. Congratulations, you just deployed a new project to Vercel. And we even get confetti. Okay, let's click on Continue to Dashboard. And then we get different domains for free. And we have a separate domain for each commit, basically. That's this one here. We have a domain for this main branch, and then we have this domain here, which basically just references the project. So as you can see, it has the project name, Next.js e-commerce recording coding and flow.vercel.app. Let's open this one here, because this one will stay the same, even if we deploy more changes. We copy this URL, because we still have to add it as the redirect URL to our Google Cloud project. So let's edit our OAuth client and add this new redirect URI with our Vercel domain and then the same endpoint here after the slash, because this is what Next.js requires. We save this, and now we should be able to log in on our Vercel domain as well. So let's see if this works. We are still logged out right now. Let's see if we can add an item to the cart. This seems to work. Let me close the website and open it again and see if the cart is still intact. Refresh the page. This seems to work. Let's take a look into our database where we should find a new cart without a user ID. That's this one here. And we should have the same cart ID in our cookie. So let's check the application tab. And here is the local cart ID that ends with 597. So this works just like in development. Let's see if we can log into our Google account. Yeah, and it works. And it merged this new clone trooper into our shopping cart. And whenever you make a change to your project, you only have to push these changes to the main branch and they will automatically be deployed by Vercel. You don't even have to click anything. Every change that you push to the main branch will automatically be deployed, and then a minute later it will be available on your website. Let's also check if the social media preview works. For this we can use this socialsharepreview.com website, and here we can add our domain and then see if we see our open graph image. So Flowmason, we make your wallet cry, and there's our OG image. As I explained, this is this open graph image in our app folder. I added this to the starting project, but for a single product page on /products/ID, we use the product image as the OG image. So let's see if this works as well. So I go to a single product, I copy this URL, and then we should see our clone trooper instead. Clone trooper, Flowmason, and the description of the product. And this is what you will see if you post a link to our website on Facebook, Twitter, or any of these social media websites. Really cool. Congratulations, you built your own e-commerce website and deployed it to production. Now you could buy a domain, for example, a real domain, connect it to your project, and then put Amazon out of business. If this tutorial was any helpful, please do me a favor and leave a like on this video. This shows me that there's more interest in tutorials like this. And also leave a comment what kind of project tutorials you want to see in the future. And lastly, I would be happy if you follow me on Twitter, because there I release regular little coding tips that I figure out while I'm preparing these projects. My Twitter handle is codinginflow. And then I wish you a nice rest of the day. Happy coding. Take care.